collapse of one of America's biggest investment banks has sent shockwaves around the world. Share prices have plummeted.
It's now finished here on the New York Stock Exchange at the end of the most extraordinary session in living memory. The Dow Jones average has closed more than 700 points lower, its biggest one-day points fall on record.
This has truly been a manic Monday on Wall Street.
Our entire economy is in danger. So I propose that the federal government reduce the risk posed by these troubled assets and supply urgently needed money so banks and other financial institutions can avoid collapse.
During the financial crisis of 2008, a document appeared on the internet describing a new type of money. This new type of money is peer-to-peer. Instead of relying on the banking system or any other central authority to verify transactions, Bitcoin uses the network itself. The mystery surrounding the invention of Bitcoin has been well publicized, being created by an anonymous person or group of people going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. Satoshi published the 2008 document detailing the design of the Bitcoin network, and in early 2009, the associated computer code was ready. Satoshi then created Bitcoin by hitting a button on the keyboard. Bitcoin has become a global phenomenon. As of 2021, more than 100 million people are reported to own Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. The largest single transaction to date involved $1.1 billion worth of Bitcoin, and the cryptocurrency industry as a whole is currently worth over $1.5 trillion, more than half the gross domestic product of the United Kingdom. Although the detailed workings of Bitcoin can be complicated, in some ways it is similar to the traditional monetary system.
Personal accounts, often called checking accounts. Frank Hamilton is depositing some money, and also a check, his paycheck. He receives no money for his work. But in the bookkeeping department of the bank, the amount of the deposit is credited to Mr. Hamilton's account. In other words, it is added to the amount of his credit in the bank. Meanwhile, the amount of the check is deducted from the amount of credit available to Mr. Hamilton's employer.
The system that verified the balance on an account was historically analogue, and back-office records were stored on magnetic tape. Debit and credit cards have actually been around since the late 1950s, but it was in the 1990s, when the internet went mainstream, that the banking system became digital.
The internet evolved into a commercial phenomenon.
Eventually, the majority of transactions were performed electronically, and we touched less and less of our physical money. In this respect, Bitcoin is quite similar. It also uses a ledger or statement of transactions, except in the case of Bitcoin, the ledger is copied across a network of thousands of machines around the world, rather than just on a computer at a bank or other central authority. Another important difference is that the owner of the bitcoins is not represented in the system by their personal details. Instead, a sequence of numbers are generated to represent the owner. This does not mean, however, that Bitcoin is anonymous.
Bitcoin always moves from one address to another, and that just looks like a string of characters, numbers and characters. And you usually do not know who this string of characters, this address belongs to, unless you are the one who sends it to it, or if you got the identity of the person. Like, for example, an exchange knows that, like, Stefan King bought these Bitcoins at the exchange and then he withdrew them to another address, and most likely that address also belongs to him, right? So then at that moment, a pseudonymous number, string of characters, an address becomes connected to my real world identity. Now, you could then extend that and say, okay, I'm going to analyze the whole blockchain, all the transactions that have ever been done, and I'm going to see if there's groups of transactions that I can tie to one identity, right? So, for example, I receive a bunch of Bitcoin transactions in a wallet, and they're all at separate addresses. And then if I send all those balances to one next address, that means that all those previous ones are belonging to the same person, right? So by moving around transactions, you start to slowly leak more data about who owns it. And there's specialized software companies who try to analyze that and de-anonymize it as much as possible. And that is the reason that practicing illegal activities with Bitcoin has become a lot more difficult and risky. But if you are very diligent about making sure that your address never is connected to your identity, then it would actually be anonymous. So it has the potential to be anonymous, but in practice, it is very difficult to do that.
There have been earlier versions of electronic cash. However, Bitcoin is the first digital currency to be decentralized and to solve the double spending problem. Double spending is when a person or entity tries to use the same currency for more than one transaction.
If I have one Bitcoin and I create a transaction that sends you one Bitcoin, but I also create a transaction that sends myself the same Bitcoin back to myself, how does everybody agree which is the right transaction? Because if everyone agrees that both of them are the right transactions, I started off with one Bitcoin and I've ended off still with that one Bitcoin, but I paid you a Bitcoin. So I've just created a Bitcoin out of thin air. So we need a way for all the nodes in the network to come to a consensus of either I paid you one or I kept it. Which one happened?
Bitcoin solves the double spending problem with the use of cryptography and blockchain technology. Cryptography is a method of protecting data so that only those for whom the data is intended can read and process it. Bitcoin uses cryptography for the generation of private keys which form a digital signature that validates every transaction. The blockchain is the innovation that enables the ledger or list of transactions to be stored on thousands of machines and therefore maintained not by the bank but by everyone in the network. But why do we need a peer-to-peer type of money? What's wrong with using the bank? Well, Satoshi was pretty clear about the motivation for creating Bitcoin. Within the first block of transactions that started the Bitcoin network, Satoshi entered a string of characters relating to an article appearing on the front page of the Times newspaper on the same day that Bitcoin was created. The article refers to the bailouts given to the banks during the financial crash of 2008. Also in the forum where the Bitcoin design document was posted, Satoshi said that the conventional banking system was continually breaching people's trust.
You can certainly see that there's a lot of dissatisfaction at the time with the traditional banking system. They didn't like the inflation that the Fed was causing, they didn't like the financial crisis, they didn't like the continual printing of money and the amount of debt that was being produced.
He was very frustrated with the central banking system and in general the financial system as it was and it still is right now, and he wanted to change it.
In reaction to the financial crisis of 2008, the UK government undertook austerity measures in an attempt to balance the country's books. Between 2010 and 2019, the government cut more than £30 billion from welfare payments, housing subsidies and social services. This had a devastating effect on the most vulnerable members of society.
A UN envoy claims the government's austerity policies are causing unnecessary misery for millions of people. Professor Philip Alston said spending cuts have led to extreme hardship.
Very important report that came out yesterday. Austerity has inflicted misery on people. Philip Alston, the UN's rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, has ended a mission to Britain with this declaration, despite the UK being the world's 5th largest economy. Levels of child poverty are not just a disgrace, and I'm quoting, but a social calamity and an economic disaster.
This map, based on data from the Trussell Trust, shows the local authorities coloured in green that have food banks. In 2009, 29 local authorities had food banks. By 2013, that number had increased to 251. And this data only represents one of the charities giving out food. After 2013, the number of food banks within those local authorities doubled. While the UK government was squeezing £30 billion out of services for the poorest in the country, it was simultaneously printing hundreds of billions of pounds and giving it directly to the banks, the people who caused the financial crash. At the same time that Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin, the Bank of England injected an initial £75 billion into the economy by printing new money. This was used to buy up the toxic assets that the banks had created. Then in May 2009, the Bank of England decided it would need to print an additional £50 billion, bringing the total to £125 billion. In August 2009, money printing was increased to £175 billion, and in November to £200 billion. In October 2011, the money printing was increased again to £275 billion. In February 2012 to £325 billion, and in July to £375 billion. In 2016, a further £60 billion was printed, bringing the total to £435 billion. And in a BBC Radio 4 programme in 2018, it was said that the money printing continued to well over £500 billion. So how can the Bank of England just create £500 billion of free money? On the 15th of August 1971, President Nixon decoupled the United States dollar from the gold standard.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. We will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest.
Nixon said that this was a temporary measure, but it continues until today. The decoupling meant that the United States dollar and other currencies around the world became fiat currencies. A fiat currency is completely controlled by the government and central banks. It has no intrinsic value. With fiat currency, whenever a government needs more money, it simply changes the amount that it says it has.
Politicians might deny it, but there really is a magic money tree. And since the financial crisis a decade ago, it's produced well over £500 billion. That's a staggering sum. I'm Michael Robinson, and in this programme we'll be trying to find out what really happened to that tidal wave of money. You have to walk down long corridors to get to the money tree. It's kept under strict security in the dealing rooms of the Bank of England. Bank officials say we're the first journalists ever to have seen it or to be shown how it works.
My name's Sarah John and I'm the head of the Sterling Markets Division at the Bank of England.
Okay, so you are the people who make the money come into being?
That's correct, yes. So,
on a standard laptop computer, Sarah John showed me how money is created. The process has a baffling name, quantitative easing, or QE. But it's surprisingly simple to do.
Screen that's in the middle of what we would call a QE gilt auction.
So here on the screen we got a list of banks?
That's right. So the individual banks are telling us which gilt they're going to sell us, how much they're going to sell us, and how much they're willing to sell it to us for.
OK, you've got all the offers in, now what happens?
So we've reached the end of the auction process now, and very simply there's a button on my screen that you can see that says allocate.
Where? Oh, got it.
Just over here. So once I push the allocate button, hey presto, I've bought £1 billion of gilts.
So that's it, you push a button and you bought £1 billion?
That's correct.
Where did the money come from?
That money is created by the central bank.
That comes out of thin air? Essentially, it's out of nowhere. You did it by hitting the button.
That's right. We can create that money just by the push of a button.
Injecting £500 billion of free money may have been designed to stimulate the UK economy, but it was given directly to the banks, and the free money stayed within the finance sector. Only around 0.8% of it found its way into the real economy. A further £100 billion of free money was subsequently given to retail banks. This was an attempt to encourage banks to give loans to small businesses. But this money went to wealthy property investors and only had the effect of driving up the cost of buying a home. We might ask the UK government why it was necessary to cut spending and inflict austerity on ordinary people in order to save £30 billion, while at the same time thoroughly shaking the magic money tree to the tune of £600 billion for the finance sector.
I'm being honest with you. There isn't a magic money tree that we can shake that suddenly provides for everything that people want.
There isn't a magic money tree.
If we thought the United Kingdom was printing a lot of free money, it's nothing compared to the United States.
We all know about TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, where $700 billion taxpayer dollars went to bail out the banks in 2008. But it turns out that $700 billion is just a small part of a much larger pool of money that has gone into propping up our nation's financial system. According to a team at Bloomberg News, at one point last year, the U.S. had lent, spent, or guaranteed as much as $12.8 trillion to rescue the economy. That's trillion with a T.
The central bank scam is really a hidden tax. The nation sells bonds to the central bank to pay for things it does not have the political will to raise taxes to pay for. But the bonds are purchased with money the central bank creates out of nothing. More money in circulation makes your money worth less. The government gets as much money as it needs, and the people pay for it in inflation. The beauty of the plan is that not one person in 1,000 can figure it out because it's usually hidden behind complex-sounding economics gibberish.
This all sounds pretty bad, but it gets even worse, at least 10 times worse. The banking system operates under a fractional reserve system. This means that any bank is allowed to pretend that it has at least 10 times the amount of money it actually has, and then lend this fictitious money out and charge interest on it. This fractional reserve system has been in place for centuries. Shockingly, up until the last few years, it was hardly ever talked about outside of banking circles.
Called the Bank of North America, the new bank was closely modeled after the Bank of England. It was allowed to practice fractional reserve banking. That is, it could lend out money it didn't have, then charge interest on it. If you or I were to do that, we would be charged with fraud, a felony.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have again been shaking their magic money trees. The UK government injected a few £100 billion more, and the United States injected a few trillion more dollars. Although the process of injecting free money into the economy might seem like a new idea, with a complicated name like quantitative easing, this process has also been in operation for a long time. In fact, it has been in use for well over 100 years and was introduced at the same time that the Federal Reserve was created. It was the Aldrich-Vreeland Act in 1908 that paved the way for the ability of banks to create money out of thin air. 2 years after the Act was passed by the House of Representatives, there was a secret meeting on Jekyll Island that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve.
On the evening of November 22nd, 1910, some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America boarded Senator Aldrich's private rail car and in the strictest secrecy journeyed to this place, Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. Secrecy was so tight that all 7 primary participants were cautioned to use only first names to prevent servants from learning their identities.
Many people are deeply concerned about the massive injection of free, non-productive money into economies during the last 13 years. In fact, about 1/5 of all the dollars that exist in the entire world were printed in 2020. Hyperinflation occurs when there is a rapid increase in the supply of money that is not supported by growth in the economy. Probably the most famous example of this is Zimbabwe, where the country printed more than 80 trillion Zimbabwean dollars in 2006 to pay off loans and salaries for civil servants. Just 2 years later, the inflation rate was 12.5 million%. Some ATM machines displayed a data overflow error because they couldn't cope with the number of zeros in a modest withdrawal. Notes in the millions of dollars were useful only as toilet paper. And the government couldn't import enough paper to print the money on. It is unlikely that the United States will enter into hyperinflation on this scale, but it stands to reason that printing trillions of dollars of free money devalues the money that was already in circulation and will lead to an increase in the cost of living.
Today, people are being squeezed out of food, clothing, necessities because of rising prices. Just think back to 1939 and prices at that time. A broadcloth shirt, 88 cents. A pair of shoes, $1.95. And as for food, butter, 31 cents a pound. Chuck roast, 15 cents. Then prices started upward.
If inflation gets too high, central banks such as the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve have the option to increase interest rates. This has the effect of lowering inflation because it tends to reduce the amount of money that is in circulation. Basically, in this situation, people prefer to save money in order to receive the higher interest rates on savings. However, it also means that loans to businesses are more expensive, and companies will choose not to undertake any plans for expansion. Overall, higher interest rates cause a shrinking of the economy and job losses. If the timing is not done correctly, and the interest rate is increased too quickly, then there will be a recession. Even before COVID-19, many people were having to work longer hours or take on a second job in order to make ends meet. And most people will attest to the fact that our money does not go as far as it used to. In economic terms, this is called a loss of purchasing power. Most major currencies have in fact been losing their purchasing power for a long time. The data confirms what we already know from our own first-hand experiences. With this in mind, and the unprecedented amount of money printing in recent years, it is difficult to imagine any other scenario other than the economy getting even more out of balance and the cost of living increasing further still. Young people in particular are likely to find it increasingly difficult to own their own home and plan for their financial future. This is not the first time that ordinary people have been squeezed by the banking system. In fact, this is just the latest episode in a series of practices pursued by central banks for centuries, aimed at increasing wealth for a few at the cost of everyone else.
Now here's the Fed money-making process. Step 1. The Federal Open Market Committee approves the purchase of U.S. bonds on the open market. Step 2. The bonds are purchased by the Fed from whoever is offering them for sale on the open market. Step 3. The Fed pays for the bonds with electronic credits to the seller's bank, which in turn credits the seller's bank account. The trick is that these credits are based on nothing. The Fed just creates them. Step 4. The banks use these deposits as reserves. They can loan out over 10 times the amount of their reserves to new borrowers, all at interest. In this way, a Fed purchase of, say, $1 million worth of bonds gets turned into over $10 million in bank accounts.
And even when the bankers lose, they still, somehow, manage to win.
For 14 years, he was the man in charge of the nation's fourth largest investment bank, Lehman Brothers. Not only was he the longest-serving CEO on Wall Street, Dick Fuld was also considered one of its toughest.
Since 2000, you've taken home more than $480 million. That's almost $500 million. And that's difficult to comprehend for a lot of people. Your company is now bankrupt, our economy is in a state of crisis, but you get to keep $480 million. I have a very basic question for you. Is this fair?
So how does Bitcoin compare with the current monetary system? Bitcoin is a digital currency, a decentralized system which records transactions in a distributed ledger called a blockchain.
Digital currency that cannot be stopped, because actually Bitcoin is not the first digital currency. There have been many attempts, some more successful than others, but they were centralized, so it was very easy for government to shut down the company behind those digital currency, or just take out the servers and the network is done. With Bitcoin, it's like this unstoppable network, because you only need like a couple of nodes remaining in order to be able to regrow, let's say, the network.
It is all over the place. It runs on every node. Every node in the network has all the transactions that have ever been done and is capable of verifying when they receive a transaction whether it's a real one or not. The miners equally, they're also decentralized. The Bitcoins themselves are decentralized. Everything is not in one place. So no one can go to one place and stop it.
In order for the system to work in a decentralized way, there needs to be a set of predetermined rules that enable the system to make decisions and maintain accuracy. This is called a consensus mechanism.
Now, consensus in a cryptocurrency refers to the state of the ledger. So you have a balance. I have a balance, you have a balance. Everyone who owns this currency has a balance on an address or on multiple addresses, and we all have to be able to see and agree that if I send some money to you, that it's debited from my balance and credited to your balance. That is how a cryptocurrency works. If it's a centralized currency, a centralized digital currency, then we trust the bank to keep the record that it's debited from mine and credited to yours. But if you want to have a cryptocurrency, then we all have to be able to see that, hey, I cryptographically sign a transaction. That means that now we all can see that my balance is less and your balance is more. So that is the consensus. That is, of course, the day-to-day consensus about the state of the ledger. But we also need to have consensus on the way that we achieve that consensus. So in the case of Bitcoin and many other cryptocurrencies, you have different roles in the network. So you have people that just use it, a user, like I have a Bitcoin balance and I'm receiving and I'm sending. You have the miners who create blocks of transactions, and you have nodes. So they are not mining themselves, but they keep a record of all the transactions that have ever been done. They're looking at all the transactions that people want to do, and they only add the blocks to their node that they see are following all the rules of the consensus algorithm. Now, sometimes if there's a disagreement about how those rules function, like some people say, well, we should probably change these and these and these rules. It should be a bit different. Then everyone else has to decide, do they agree with that or not?
One example of consensus being reached on the Bitcoin blockchain is Taproot. The Taproot upgrade provides greater transaction efficiency and unlocked the potential for automated contracts. The approval process for Taproot started in May 2019, with one of the Bitcoin core developers writing a proposal. There was an active discussion online, and in January 2020, the proposal was formally submitted to the Bitcoin Improvement Proposals list. This list is held on GitHub, the community platform for software developers with around 60 million users. Bitcoin miners then voted on whether or not to accept the upgrade by including a small amount of encoded information in the blocks that were mined during a 2-week period. This chart represents those blocks. The blocks that signalled their approval for Taproot are coloured green. 90% of the blocks must be green in order for the upgrade to be accepted, representing 1,815 out of 2,016 blocks.
In the case of Taproot, it took a very long time to build the consensus that Taproot was a good idea, because a lot of Bitcoiners, they were remembering the block size debate, and they saw the unnecessary strife and like civil war that caused. So they said, let's do this really slowly and do everything by the book. And okay, so there's a proposal. The programmers say we should probably do this. Do the miners agree with that? Do the users agree with that? Does the exchanges agree with that? Do all the other people in the system agree with that, yes or no? And then they had this very formal process where miners can signal whether they are pro or con this development, right? And then you can see over time if there's enough consensus to actually do this. It's a careful way of making changes, and it makes Bitcoin more difficult to change quickly, but it guarantees that there will not be unnecessary strife about what is a real Bitcoin and what is not.
At this point, we should say a bit more about blocks and Bitcoin miners. Bitcoin transactions are grouped together into blocks. A block contains 1 megabyte of data, which could represent a few hundred or a few thousand transactions, depending on how much data each transaction contains. The Bitcoin network generates a target hash, which is a number based on data in the block. Miners try to determine what this value is by testing out all possible values.
First person that solves that problem wins a prize. He gets some Bitcoin as a reward, he gets all the transaction fees as a reward, and he pushes that block out. And if you ever find a chain, once you've received all these blocks, if you ever find a different chain that's had more work done on it, you throw away what you've seen and you say, okay, this new chain, this is actually the truth, because more work has been done on it. So that's really good at securing the network, because it's very difficult for somebody to get enough computing power to build like a separate chain that's longer, that everyone will believe is the truth. And even if you could do that, there are economic incentives in place for you to just play by the rules, because if you had that much money to be able to do that, you would make more money just by mining honestly.
In theory, anyone can be a Bitcoin miner. You just have to allocate sufficient computing resources to find the target hash. However, over time, more miners enter into the network, and the system automatically adjusts to make it more difficult to find the target hash. So, more computer power is needed. For a number of years, it was possible to mine Bitcoin with a small home-based computer rig, but it is now only financially viable if you have an industrial-scale setup. This has led to miners pooling resources.
Mining is very difficult to do as one entity by yourself, because the probability of you finding the next block is very small, because there's many other miners. So then you have this very spike-like payout that you could be mining for months or weeks without any return, and then suddenly you get a whole block of Bitcoins, and then you have to wait a long time again. Now, to solve that problem, you can actually pool, and that smooths out your pay. So you have a consistent amount of Bitcoin coming in because you're contributing to this pool, and you're only making sure that this pool will have a reasonable chance of finding the right block. Now, the bigger the block, of course, the more smooth the payout will be. So that creates an incentive for joining a bigger mining pool rather than a smaller one. And then you would have several big mining pools. And if one of them is really big, that creates a type of centralization in the mining where theoretically they could start manipulating and choosing which transactions to process and which not to process. And that is against the idea of unstoppable money. That is against the idea of a decentralized system.
However, in practice, the mining community has so far been dynamic, either through choice or because of changing circumstances. In May 2021, China banned Bitcoin mining operations, which led to a major shift in the global distribution of mining. There is also an ongoing discussion about potential upgrades to ensure mining pools continue to be sufficiently decentralized. For example, the Stratum v2 upgrade. Stratum version 2 is designed to make data transfers more efficient, thereby reducing the physical infrastructure requirements, which may allow for more miners. It also proposes to introduce a job negotiation system, whereby miners can select which transactions they want to verify, which could also have the effect of spreading the distribution of mining activity more widely. Once the details of the Stratum version 2 protocol have been ironed out, it will formally be submitted to the Bitcoin Improvement Proposal list on GitHub, just as Taproot was. Mining Bitcoin involves a lot of computational power and electricity. This has sparked a debate about the impact Bitcoin might have on the environment. There are several points worth mentioning in connection with this.
I think that the regulation or the effort doesn't necessarily need to be on the crypto people to justify why they're using energy. Energy is a scarce resource, as we know, and people pay for it.
Consuming energy, electricity, is not necessarily bad. It depends on where you produce this energy, how you produce the energy.
Bitcoin mining is not wasteful. It's a very efficient way of converting electricity into security. Every single hash that a miner goes through gives me more confidence that my money is secure.
The mining process requires that people spend energy to find a block. And that is actually a good thing because it guarantees that people have to invest in something concrete up front before they get to have the right to say, I want these transactions to be added. right? And so there is something from outside of the system that comes into the system to guarantee the integrity of the system, right? And that in the case of a proof of work algorithm, that resource is electricity. And you could say it's the price of security.
This might sound irresponsible. However, it is useful to compare cryptocurrencies with other technological innovations that use electricity, such as electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are not criticised for using electricity. That's because they reduce carbon emissions. However, electric vehicles only reduce carbon emissions during the lifetime of the vehicle in countries where the electricity is generated from renewable sources. A report published in Nature in 2020 looked at the potential reduction in carbon emissions from electric vehicles in 59 world regions. In 95% of these regions, electric cars were associated with a reduction in carbon emissions compared to petrol-fuelled cars, but the reduction in emissions was totally dependent on the proportion of electricity that is derived from renewable sources. In Poland, where electricity generation is still mostly based on coal, average lifetime emissions from electric cars are the same as petrol cars. In countries like Sweden and France, which get most of their electricity from renewables and nuclear sources, average lifetime emissions from electric cars are up to 70% lower than petrol cars. And in the UK, where about 40% of the electricity is from renewable sources, electric cars produce 30% less emissions. So, shouldn't we also judge cryptocurrencies based on how the electricity is generated rather than how much they use? Bitcoin miners are also incentivized to move permanently to locations that have cheaper electricity, which tends to be from renewable sources.
If there is a more efficient way to get energy, then people will definitely do it because it'll be cheaper for them to mine then. So I think you might see it used to drive innovation.
Because the mining industry is so cutthroat, the profit margins are tiny. You need to get the absolute cheapest electricity you can to be able to remain profitable while mining. They're often pushed to renewable energy sources. So there's a big push by the governments around the world to try and encourage new renewable energy like power sources. But the problem is, say if you build a massive hydroelectric dam in the middle of nowhere, it's fine when you can pipe that electricity off to a town that's relatively close. But if nobody's using the electricity in that town, what do you do with all this extra electricity? It's very hard to store.
Because power production curve usually is pretty flat and only fluctuates a little bit, but the demand has spikes and changes very quickly. For example, when people leave their work and move to their homes, they will start switching ACs on, they will start using TVs, they will start charging their cars, they will start doing a lot of other things that suddenly in this area the electricity demand spikes. But before that, all of this extra electricity was just being wasted because nobody was using it. What Bitcoin miners would allow in this area to do is to flatten the demand curve and take over all of the unused electricity. That also makes the price of electricity for everybody else cheaper, because before that they had to also pay for the wasted electricity. That was because the cost of producing this electricity was still there, but because nobody was using it, then the price of the electricity they were using had to take that into account and be higher.
Well, mining is literally the process of converting energy into value. So all the time when this hydroelectric power plant can't be generating electricity and sending it off to a city, they can be generating that electricity, mining Bitcoin in-house, and that's subsidizing the cost of their hydroelectric dam. So in theory, that would encourage a lot more renewable energy plants to be made, because they can subsidize their costs by mining Bitcoin when they can't, instead of having to store power inefficiently or just turn everything off, they can mine and make money. Mining Bitcoin could advance the process of renewable energy by about a decade because of this incentive.
So, how does Bitcoin compare with the traditional banking system in terms of inflation and the value of the currency? Well, Bitcoins cannot be randomly created. There is a cap on the maximum number of Bitcoins that can exist. This is hardwired into the system, and if there was ever a change to this, it could only be done with the agreement of all the different parties using the system.
With Bitcoin, you've got the 21 million coin limit, and it's publicly auditable. Everybody can check that there are 21 million or less coins in existence.
Bitcoins get created as a reward for the mining. So the miner who wins the block and who gets the right to add a block to the blockchain, they get the new Bitcoins that are created. They also get the fees for processing the transactions. But the new Bitcoins are created as a reward for the miners. Now, there is a schedule that is part of the rules of the software that runs the network. So as long as everyone agrees that this is a good issuance schedule and it's part of the rules and they're willing to enforce those rules with their node and to mine based on those rules, and us as users only accepting Bitcoins that conform to those rules, as long as we all agree that there will only be 21 million Bitcoins, then that means there will only be 21 million Bitcoins.
Conversely, we have seen that central banks do whatever they like, usually to protect the interests of the rich and powerful without the agreement of anyone else. And in some cases, we only find out after the fact. Another objection that has been used against Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is not real money.
Bitcoin is worthless artificial gold. Now, that is not something I think the world needs.
Why would you want it? You would want it for the same reason that you want to run electric power to your city, or you would want to run running water to your building, because civilization is based on clean energy, clean water, clean communications, clean money, right? It is an extraordinarily important thing.
And the fact that it's clever computer science doesn't mean that it should be widely used and that respectable people should encourage other people to speculate in it.
An institutional grade safe haven asset. It's gold without all the imperfections of gold on a digital monetary network that moves at the speed of light that you can program to do 1 million transactions a second. So we believe there's $100 trillion total addressable market for a digital monetary network. It makes sense to buy as much of that asset class as we can.
Even some of the strongest opponents are now investing in Bitcoin and other major cryptocurrencies, or copying the technology to try and create their own version of them. And with 100 million users, it is safe to say that cryptocurrencies have moved beyond the initial experiment phase. Over thousands of years, humans have used a wide range of different objects for account keeping or as a means of exchange. One of the most interesting are tally sticks. The earliest tally sticks are more than 40,000 years old. For example, the Lebombo bone, a baboon's fibula that contains 29 distinct notches that are thought to be used as some kind of record keeping. In more recent times, in medieval England, at the start of the 12th century, King Henry I introduced split tally sticks. The sticks had a series of notches of varying thickness that represented a specific value. A cut the size of the palm of a hand represented £1,000. A cut the size of a thumb represented £100. A cut the breadth of a little finger meant £1, and so on. The notches went across the full width of the stick, and the stick was vertically split in half. The issuer kept half of the stick, and the other half was given as a receipt. Each half of the stick also had the details of the transaction written on it in ink. These split sticks might seem like a novelty. However, they are the longest running form of money in history, being used for more than 700 years. Incidentally, it was the burning of the split sticks in 1834 that caused the fire at the Houses of Parliament in London that nearly destroyed the entire building, and the design of the gates at the entrance to the National Archives in London is inspired by tally sticks. Interestingly, the way split tally sticks worked has similarities with Bitcoin. Bitcoin uses a public key and a private key. The public key is the digital wallet address or number that is used to store the coins, and the private key is a digital signature that is linked to the public key. Both the public and private keys are needed in order to perform a transaction, in a similar way that half of the tally stick was kept by the issuer and half given as a receipt. Bitcoin could also be the money that the internet has been waiting for.
The technology that made internet possible is quite simple. You have two computer systems and there is a connection between them. It used to be a phone line and then it was a fiberglass cable and there are satellites. Right, so you have a computer system here that has data, can compute data, and there's another one here, and you can connect the two. And then if you have a network of that becomes really powerful as a communication medium. And we've seen over the last 30 years or so how effective that is at influencing the world. The fact that we are all just connected now. And now money had actually been isolated from that development for a very long time because you didn't have digital scarcity. You could have digital money. So you could say, this bank owes you this much money, and then if you transfer that to another bank, then this other bank owes that person so much money, right? So you can keep the balances, but it requires a centralized institution such as a bank and a government that guarantees the scarcity of the paper money to have a functioning financial system. So you make the transfers digital, but the creation of the money is not digital. It still requires the authority of a central institution, of two important institutions, banks and government. Now, what it means to have digital money is to say that the creation of the money and the transfer of the money are both happening on the internet. So you have a computer here, you have a computer there, there's a connection in between. It's not just information that flows from one computer to the other. It's also value, money. Like you can express, you can put a price on things, and the scarcity and the transmission of the money are both equally digital.
At the moment, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are somewhat cumbersome to use, and the transaction fees are high for smaller transaction amounts. However, enthusiasts say that the current stage is probably equivalent to the early stages of the internet and email. In June 2021, El Salvador announced that it will be the first country in the world to make Bitcoin legal tender.
So what does this mean? Legal tender means that if you have outstanding debt, then you have to receive payment for that debt in the money that is legal tender. In this case, that would be Bitcoin. So if somebody owes you money and they say, well, I'm going to pay you back in Bitcoin, you have to accept that. You can pay taxes in Bitcoin. So it's a very strong engine of adoption. So a lot of people now will have a reason to have Bitcoin, to receive Bitcoin, to spend Bitcoin, to earn Bitcoin. So it becomes a money network in parallel to the dollar. So El Salvador is a dollarized country. That means they use the dollar to collect taxes, to pay for stuff, to price things in the store. And they will still continue to price things in dollars, but any shopkeeper is actually forced to accept Bitcoin and dollars. If someone comes and says, I want to pay with Bitcoin, they have to take it. So that sounds a little bit forceful, but on the other hand, they also can instantly convert the Bitcoin back to dollars, and the government is guaranteeing that availability. So you have, on the one hand, a lot of people who do not have banking infrastructure. According to the president of El Salvador, it's 70% of the population does not have a bank account. So all those people can now receive Bitcoin and spend Bitcoin. Because any shop that has the right kind of setup to accept Bitcoin, they will accept it. So it's a really important step in Bitcoin's development that now a whole country is recognizing it as money. It's not a financial asset. You don't have to pay capital gains on it. It's a currency. And you can pay your taxes in it. You can pay debt in it. So it's really important for the adoption. And it's going to be an example for the rest of the world, especially developing countries, where you have a lot of people that don't have a bank account. And this narrative has slowed down a bit. Like a few years ago, people were talking about, well, Bitcoin can like bank the unbanked. And you heard a lot about how that was going to be important. And then other things happened, and we didn't really talk about that all that much anymore. And we were talking among friends usually about what is the next step of adoption for Bitcoin. And everyone was thinking, well, maybe a sovereign wealth fund of a big country will start using it, or a central bank will put it on their balance sheet. And that will be the next evolutionary step for Bitcoin. However, it turns out that it's this legal tender thing. So a whole country will use it as money. And now that will be an example for other countries to also start using it as money.
This event was immortalised into the Bitcoin blockchain in a similar way that Satoshi Nakamoto referenced the bailing out of the banks in the first block in the network. This time, it is block number 686,938 that bears the message which reads, "Assembly approves Bitcoin law," referring to the front page headline carried by an El Salvadoran daily newspaper on the day of the announcement. However, the central banks are not going to give up their monopoly on money easily. Aside from the misinformation that is perpetually released about cryptocurrencies, central banks are busy developing their own versions of Bitcoin. These are known as central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. An important aspect of CBDCs is that they are centralised. They are governed by a country's monetary policy, and therefore suffer from all of the same problems that the existing fiat monetary system suffers from. CBDCs are very different from what Satoshi Nakamoto envisaged. In addition, CBDCs could be used to monitor every transaction that individual people perform, and any transactions that the government or any other powerful central authority doesn't like could be blocked. Bitcoin represents a unique opportunity. This is the first time in history that the various technological elements have come together to provide a genuinely decentralized monetary system. Bitcoin is an innovation that is led by the people.
Normally these sort of really early opportunities to like revolutionary technology are only open to people in Wall Street. This is probably the first thing where the average members of the public have had access to it years before Wall Street is even allowed to touch it.
Cryptocurrencies have a long way to go, but if implemented correctly, they have the potential to provide a much more fair, more sustainable alternative type of money, and a type of money that is appropriate for the internet age. The cat is already out of the bag. The system is already running on thousands of machines. It only remains for us to decide what we want to do with it.